Imagine this. It's midwinter. Dawn is still just a whisper, maybe 8:30 a.m. And there's this brutal gale whipping sleet across the moors. You're hunched down, freezing, straining your eyes in the gloom, and then you see them. 15 dark shapes just hunkered down, facing right into the wind. Black grouse. And as the light gets a bit stronger, you start making out the details. Their white rumps, the black and white wings, those tiny little shrunken red combs above their eyes. Then suddenly one just spreads his tail and makes this sound. It's exactly like a logger can sneeze. It's just this, well, delightfully eccentric and yet really gorgeous spectacle unfolding. But here's the thing, the core mystery. These male birds, they carry all that really conspicuous, elaborate plumage all year round, but it's all for just one intense fortnight in April. That's their breeding season. Why? What do they expend all that energy, take all that risk with predators? Just for that short burst of courtship. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a fantastic observation.
Yeah.
And it points right to one of the most powerful and maybe often overlooked evolutionary forces that Charles Darwin really emphasized: sexual selection. What you're seeing there with those black grouse, it's evolution basically diverting a species' plumage, its behavior, almost entirely towards courtship success.
Yeah.
It can sometimes be a case of, survival be damned for the sake of reproduction. The core insight, really, is that sometimes looking good for a potential mate matters even more than just, staying alive.
Right. And here's the question, maybe the central question for you listening. Can the same be true of you? Are aspects of our own bodies, our mind, designed not primarily for survival, but actually for courtship?
Precisely. And our mission in this deep dive is to explore this, pretty radical idea that many human traits, from our physical bodies right through to our minds, our art, even our sense of humor, they might actually be shaped primarily by mate choice. Mm-hmm. We're going to draw some, I think, quite surprising parallels with these fascinating birds. And dive into some truly insightful research, stuff that really challenges some long-held beliefs about what makes us human.
Okay, so we started with the black grouse on their leek. That's their traditional communal display ground where the males gather to show off, right, to attract females. But let's be clear, humans were a bit different from these lekking birds. We don't really gather at specific traditional spots for these big communal displays. And we're certainly not like the few mammals that do leek. You mentioned fallow deer, black buck antelope, the white-eared cob in Africa. It's pretty rare in mammals.
That's true. We don't leak in that classic sense. But despite not being, highly polygamous or sporting really bizarre, exaggerated appendages like some birds of paradise, humans are absolutely touched by sexual selection. Definitely. Think about the crested auklets. They're in the Pacific Northwest. The lesson there is that sexual selection happens in pair-bonded, seemingly monogamous species, too. It's mutual. Both males and females are selecting the best plumage partner they can possibly get. Darwin actually considered this, then kind of rejected it. And for decades, biologists went down this path, frankly, a bit misguided in hindsight, thinking bright colors in both sexes, like in kingfishers or penguins, were just about species recognition, avoiding mating with the wrong type. But the outputs show us sexual selection isn't only about huge differences between males and females. The powerful insight here is that even when mates look pretty similar, they're still choosing each other. And they're choosing based on traits specifically designed for attraction.
And when we look at human mating systems, it gets, even more complex, doesn't it? We aren't strictly monomorphic like those auklets, where males and females look pretty much identical. Human males are, on average, larger. They have more facial and body hair, greater upper body strength, and they lack the swollen breasts that adult females have. But these differences between the sexes are actually quite modest compared to our great ape relatives. A silverback male gorilla, for instance, he weighs twice as much as a female. Huge difference. What's really unusual for us as mammals, but much more typical of birds actually, is how inclined humans are to form these really lengthy pair bonds years, sometimes decades.
Right. And just like DNA fingerprinting back in the 90s showed us that birds we thought were strictly monogamous, like skylarks, weren't always sexually faithful.
The same seems to be true for humans. Both sexes might, furtively have other liaisons while still maintaining that main pair bond to raise the kids. And occasional polygyny, one male with several females, that does happen, though it was apparently rare among hunter-gatherers, maybe became more common with sort of wealth inequality in pastoral societies, the idea of being the second wife of the 200 cattleman, perhaps being a better option sometimes. But today, pair bonds are pretty much the norm again. Economic reasons, moral codes, legal rules.
And if we connect this back, it almost certainly links to how human babies are just utterly helpless. They're like little external fetuses for their first year, really. And they take, the best part of 2 decades to become properly independent. That makes parenting very much a two-person job, which suggests it's a fundamental human instinct, this drive to form a long-term pair bond, specifically to raise offspring. It's biologically wired in.
Yeah, and a pretty sure indication of that instinct has to be the strong sexual jealousy we see in both sexes. It's the thing that just undermines every attempt at creating, free love communes. Sharing a partner, husband or wife, it just doesn't seem to come easily to people, does it?
No, it really doesn't. And another intriguing human habit, something we share with bonobos but not chimps, is this continuous sort of recreational sex, even when females aren't ovulating. And the fact that ovulation is basically undetectable to males, this really seems to point towards humans using sex as a way to reinforce and maintain those crucial pair bonds. It's not just about making babies, it's about keeping that partnership strong.
So the point is really clear then. Just because human beings usually form pair bonds, it doesn't mean sexual selection isn't acting on us. Not at all. Picking a partner for life, potentially, that's a huge decision. It really pays to get it right. So naturally, human beings are very picky. Studies show that, okay, men might fantasize more about short-term flings, maybe, but when it comes down to choosing a life partner, both sexes are equally choosy. I mean, it's the dominant theme, isn't it? And the happy ending of most romantic fiction. Anyway, we are fundamentally designed to be choosy. Okay, now for a really bold idea. Perhaps the evidence that many features of human beings have been selected by their mates has been staring us in the face, the bearded and one-sex face, for centuries. And maybe the most striking example, and it's a little disturbing maybe, is the human mind itself. Could our brains have grown so massively bigger relatively quickly in evolutionary terms, not primarily to help us survive, but actually to help us seduce each other?
This really opens up that whole idea, doesn't it? That sexual selection might explain the very start of art. Think about Darwin's observation of bowerbirds, how they tastefully ornament their little playing passages. Now, the conventional wisdom has always been, bowerbirds driven by instinct, humans have culture, separate things. But I think both ends of that claim are probably partly wrong. People are likely driven more by instinct than we often admit. And bowerbirds, well, they seem to have more culture than we usually assume. They're actually unusually large-brained birds, and they can show culture. There's an example of a spotted bowerbird learning to collect blue items, like its satin bowerbird neighbors did, instead of its usual white, green, and red stuff, just because it found itself in their territory. So the powerful insight here, I think, is that the line between instinctive display and cultural art is much, much blurrier than we thought, especially when mate choice is driving things.
That's a really great point. So our human instincts often work by making us more likely to learn certain things, right? Like, think how easily a kid might learn to be wary of snakes, even if they've never actually seen a dangerous one. It's adaptive, isn't it, to make mistakes on the side of caution, which suggests that culture and instinct aren't opposites at all. They work together. Nature operates via nurture, not versus it. We're kind of wired to learn specific things, and culture gives us the context for that learning. Which brings us neatly to the Acheulean hand axe, this teardrop-shaped, symmetrical, sharp-edged tool used by Homo erectus for an unbelievably long time, almost 1.8 million years ago, right up to maybe 300,000 years ago. And across this vast area, from Europe to Asia, and the one I have here on my desk, it's exactly the same size and shape as my computer mouse. It's kind of eerie. Two objects designed to fit the human hand, but separated by at least 500,000 years.
Yeah, they are remarkable objects. But the far greater problem the hand axe poses from an evolutionary perspective is its extreme technological stagnation. It just never changed much. Not over space, not over time. And that really defies a purely cultural explanation. Culture usually shows fairly rapid change, lots of geographical variation, think about fashion or music. Yet archaeologists have pre-consistently just assumed it was purely a product of culture. It's a classic bias, isn't it? When non-human animals show complex behavior, the default is genetics. But for humans, it's always culture, never genes. The insight here is that maybe this lack of evolution in the hand axe itself tells us something really surprising about why it was made.
Right, and I can imagine the idea of a genetic theory for human toolmaking wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms by cultural anthropologists when it first came up.
You'd be absolutely right. It caused quite a stir. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we can look at something called the Baldwin effect. It was proposed over a century ago. Think of it like this. If early humans started a cultural habit, maybe just banging rocks together, then regularly napping stone tools, that habit itself then put selective pressure back on our genes. Any individuals who happen to have, say, a genetic predisposition for better hand-eye coordination or better spatial reasoning for making tools, they'd thrive. They'd be better tool makers, maybe better providers, and leave more offspring. So our behavior, our culture, can actually drive our genetic evolution over generations. Evolution, you see, is often quite fond of endowing even really intelligent animals with genetically determined behaviors if it's an efficient shortcut to a useful skill.
Okay, so applying the Baldwin effect to these hand axes, if early hominins started napping stone tools as a cultural thing, then any mutant human being who happened to have a genetic knack for it, a propensity to be really good at this skill, would thrive. They'd leave more offspring, making the skill itself gradually more heritable, more instinctive over time. It becomes directed learning, sort of, towards an instinctive adaptive end.
Exactly. Which then raises this really important question, a perhaps still more speculative thought, from researchers like Kuhn and Mithen back in the late 90s. Could the force that shaped that emerging instinct, and maybe the entire Acheulean technology, have been sexual selection, not just natural selection for survival? I mean, this is clearly the case with the bowerbirds' bowers, right? They came into existence purely through sexual selection. They improved chances of reproduction, not survival directly. The really profound insight here, potentially, is that the very tools that define our early ancestors, these perfectly symmetrical hand axes, they might not just be about butchering animals or digging roots. They could be the earliest evidence we have of art. Art driven by that fundamental, universal desire to impress a mate. It really shifts our understanding of early human ingenuity from fairly pragmatic to deeply romantic almost.
And it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. These hand axes, they're often far more symmetrical than they strictly need to be for cutting. That makes them much harder to make. And their actual practical use seems somewhat limited, or at least debatable for some of the really fine ones. It is just like a bowerbird's bower, isn't it? A work of art, really, intended to impress a female. And the idea of human females judging a potential mate on his ability to shape a really, really good hand axe, well, it might seem absurd at first glance. But it's no more absurd, really, than a female bowerbird judging a potential mate on his ability to build a fantastic bower out of sticks and colored berries. Okay, so let's broaden this out even further. Like those bowerbirds, human beings constantly use decorations and ornaments to help them appeal to partners, existing or potential ones. Think about everything from tattoos and hairstyles to fancy cars, big houses, writing songs, painting pictures. This obsession we have with dressing to impress, in the broadest sense, it's universal, across cultures, across time. And it takes up a surprisingly large part of our consciousness, doesn't it? And a significant chunk of our budgets? Surely far too much to be explained just by, prosaic natural selection for survival. And today, of course, males are also very much interested in dressing to appeal. It's not just a one-way street.
Absolutely. And we have really ancient examples of this human adornment. Those 32,000-year-old mammoth ivory beads found on that Paleolithic man buried in Sungir, Russia. Incredible craftsmanship. Or a Neolithic child buried with his complex necklace over 8,000 years ago. Or think of the Bronze Age Queen Puabi of Ur, buried with pounds and pounds of gold jewelry about 4,500 years ago. Now, okay, some of this is signaling wealth and status for sure, but that very pursuit of profit, of wealth, which has driven so much of the world's progress and conflict, at its root, it was probably more likely to have been about sexual competition than just mere survival. The key insight is just how deeply intertwined our drive for status, for material possessions, is with our fundamental desire to attract and keep a mate.
And what about art itself? You mentioned the psychologist Geoffrey Miller. He argues, quite forcefully, I think, that you can explain art much more easily through sexual selection theory than through standard natural selection. I mean, there was that quote from Ernst Grouse back in 1897. He said, "Natural selection should long ago have rejected the peoples which wasted their force in so purposeless a way as art in favor of more practical talents, and dismissing other explanations like, oh, art is just for enjoyment, or it's to appease the gods. They don't really fully explain its persistence, its universality, or its sheer, often impractical grandiosity, do they?"
They feel like incomplete answers. A really compelling way to think about it is art as a signaling system. The sheer energy and time invested in setting these signals, like a bowerbird meticulously building its bower, or a nightingale singing its complex song for hours. It's clearly not just for fun. It's for potential sex, potential posterity, potential genetic immortality, ultimately. Miller puts it quite evocatively, suggesting that aesthetic admiration of art shades over into sexual attraction towards the artist. And there are actually studies that seem to back this up, showing a correlation between artistic success and mating success, particularly among male visual artists. So art, maybe it isn't just some accidental byproduct of having a big brain. It might actually be one of the reasons we evolved such big brains in the first place.
Okay, let's turn to humor then. Making people laugh. On the face of it, it has pretty minimal survival value, right? It doesn't directly help you find food or avoid a lion. but it demonstrably makes you popular. Especially, it seems, with the opposite sex. Poll after poll confirms it. Both sexes consistently rate a good sense of humor very highly in
Yes.
potential partners. I remember seeing one survey where I think 57% of women and 40% of men said they actually fell in love with someone partly because of their sense of humor.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense when you look at it through the lens of sexual selection, humor, storytelling, gossip, even self-consciousness. These are all features of human behavior that standard natural selection really struggles to explain convincingly. Why are they there? But sexual selection, through mate choice, it specializes in generating these kinds of apparently useless embellishments, things that don't obviously help you survive. Natural selection is often, well, dull and utilitarian in its outputs. It builds efficient machines for survival. Sexual selection is fun and strange and extravagant. Think peacock tails. The powerful insight is simply that if the trait helps you get a mate, it doesn't necessarily need to help you survive day to day. Attracting mates is enough evolutionary justification.
And thinking about this, it really challenges the traditional views of why the human brain expanded so dramatically, doesn't it? Popular theories like the social brain hypothesis, the idea that we evolved big brains to keep track of complex social groups and politics. They struggle to explain why this unique runaway expansion didn't happen in other highly social species. I mean, why are bottlenose dolphins pretty much the only other creatures that come close to rivaling our brain size relative to body size? They're social, but lots of animals are.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, sexual selection specializes in creating unique runaway expansions found in no other species, like the peacock's tail or the elk's antlers. So it becomes a really strong candidate for explaining the human brain. It's true that true Darwinists, as Miller calls them, often shied away from considering sexual selection for the human mind. Maybe it felt a bit too close to intelligent design, choice and preference driving evolution. Yet, interestingly, Darwin himself seemed to focus more and more on this kind of deliberate action or choice in evolution later in his life. The ultimate insight, perhaps the most profound one, is that our incredible minds might just be the ultimate courtship display, the human equivalent of the peacock's tail.
Wow, and Miller argues, doesn't he, that neglecting sexual selection in studying humans has left fields like anthropology, psychology, economics, social policy kind of the poorer. Yeah. They couldn't adequately explain things like our irrational thirst for luxury goods, why men historically seem to seek wealth and power more intensely than women, maybe things like student rebellion kicking in after puberty, or just the sheer explosion of creativity we see in human history. Yeah. Sexual selection offers a potential framework for all that.
Yes, it potentially offers a unifying framework. Now, a common objection you hear is, well, the brain expanded pretty much equally in both sexes, didn't it? Unlike, say, peacock tails, which are only on males. But that's not necessarily a problem for the theory. Many brightly colored birds, think parrots or penguins, they also show very similar bright coloration in both sexes. It could simply be that the brain, or the mental capacities it enables, like wit, creativity, storytelling, kindness, was a feature that both sexes valued equally in a long-term partner. And often, evolution sees no need to impose a sex difference if there's no particular advantage to doing so. Plus, brains need to be clever at both transmitting signals like making jokes or telling stories and receiving them, appreciating the jokes, understanding the stories. It requires intelligence on both sides. So the argument goes, sexual attractiveness alone driven by mutual mate choice can potentially be a sufficient explanation for almost any human mental trait.
Okay, let's take kindness as an example. People consistently say they value kindness in potential mates. It's high on the list for both men and women looking for long-term partners. We'll look no further than for why human beings might have evolved a tendency to be kind. Now, okay, it might also be partly a spillover from needing to be kind to raise children successfully, or maybe it's just enlightened self-interest in cooperative groups. Oh. But the mate choice theory is just as plausible, isn't it? If people consistently preferred kinder mates over generations, then moral behavior, or at least the capacity for it, would be bound to spread through mating preference alone. It is truly mind-bending, isn't it? To think how much of our creativity, our humor, maybe even our kindness might secretly be a performance geared towards mate choice. But as we reflect on these profound hidden forces in our own evolution, let's return to the creature that kicked off our deep dive, the black grouse. Because its flamboyant display, ironically, is set against a backdrop of a desperate struggle for survival. A struggle that's also deeply intertwined with human activity, but a different kind of selection is at play here. More direct pressure. This bird, sometimes called Europe's bird of paradise, is becoming vanishingly rare in Britain. The last national survey, I think it was 2019, found just over 4,200 males. That's a 35% drop since 2005. It's serious. And it's not just Britain. It's declining globally across Eurasia. It actually went extinct in Denmark back in 2001.
Yeah, the situation is grim. And the core problem is pretty simple, unfortunately. Black grouse just fare really poorly under the impact of modern human activity. They find modern agriculture, modern forestry practices, and just the general infrastructure of our civilization deeply uncongenial. They just can't cope well with it.
Right. They've been hit by these huge changes in land use, haven't they? Hammer blows, really. For instance, large-scale commercial forestry, planting huge blocks of single-species conifers like Sitka spruce, often with government subsidies. Initially, it seemed okay. The grouse actually thrived for a bit in the very young plantations when there was lots of open ground and heather. But then, as the trees grew dense, the light got blocked out, the undergrowth died, and the grouse basically starved and vanished. They're now almost entirely gone extinct in many of those heavily afforested areas. And then you had the changes to upland farming. Subsidies encouraging really intensive sheep grazing, which removes all the taller heather and grasses they need for food and cover, drainage schemes that shrink the boggy areas, which are vital for insects the chicks eat and can even trap the chicks themselves. And the shift from making hay, which leaves lots of seed heads, to making silage from lush, frequently cut grass, which offers them nothing. The result was losing that varied patchwork quilt habitat they need. It became this stark, clean-cut, black and white mixture of dark, dense woods and bright green, overgrazed fields. Neither is good for black grouse.
Exactly. And a fascinating but worrying problem here is how the relentless advance of human activity brought this new threat, what you might call subsidized predators. Our activities, things like roadkill, landfill sites, general refuse, even agricultural feed left out for livestock, they provide this incredibly predictable, abundant food source, especially through winter. This artificially boosts the populations of generalist predators, foxes, stoats, crows, gulls, rats. Their numbers boom. And these unnaturally high predator populations then have a devastating effect on their natural prey when breeding season comes around, like ground-nesting birds. And making the problem even worse, particularly in Britain, is that we've lost almost all our top apex predators. Eagles, wolves, lynx. They're gone from most areas. These apex predators would naturally help control the numbers of these mid-level mesopredators. Without them, the foxes and crows can thrive unchecked. The insight here is how human changes just cascade through the ecosystem in complex, often really damaging ways we didn't anticipate.
But here's the paradox, isn't it? While the black grouse has plummeted, another grouse species, the red grouse, which is unique to Britain, has actually thrived. Why? It has much simpler needs, apparently, just heather, heather, and heather, whereas the black grouse needs that varied dietary calendar, moving between different food sources through the year.
Yes, it is a paradox. And the reason for the red grouse's remarkable success also lies with human beings. Different human activities, though. Back in the 1800s, the sport of shooting red grouse became incredibly popular with the Victorian aristocracy. This led more owners to manage their land specifically for red grouse. This involved things like carefully controlled burning of heather patches to promote fresh growth, which the grouse eat, systematically trapping predators like foxes and crows, and even providing trays of grit to help the birds digest the tough heather. And this intensive management dramatically increased red grouse density, hugely, to the point where there are probably at least 50 red grouse in Britain today for every one black grouse.
Right. And the perhaps surprising positive side of this very specific management is that these moors managed primarily for grouse shooting also came to be ideal habitat for many other upland birds, animals, and plants. Things like curlews, golden plover, merlins, they thrive there too. So it's effectively become a form of privately funded conservation, protecting this rare upland heath and bog habitat, which is largely confined to the British Isles.
Crucially, yes. And this brings us back to the black grouse. It turns out that it was this intensive management for red grouse that has also somewhat accidentally saved the black grouse from potentially disappearing completely from Britain so far. Statistics show that around 90% of the black grouse that remain in England today live on or right on the edges of these managed grouse moors. These are the places where landowners control sheep numbers to protect the heather and where gamekeepers actively control predator numbers. This is their last real refuge in many areas. The core insight really is that human intervention can be both the problem and sometimes paradoxically the solution for certain species in human-dominated landscapes.
So the uncomfortable reality seems to be that just Rewilding, in its purest sense, just leaving things alone, probably won't help the black grouse much now, at least not in Britain. They seem to need what you might call managed wilding, maintaining that mosaic habitat and undertaking careful predator control because predator numbers are artificially high due to other human activities. And we've seen stark contrasts, haven't we? RSPB efforts in Wales at Lake Vyrnwy trying to help black grouse without predator control saw numbers dwindle to just 3 males left in 2023. Whereas in the Pennines, where grouse moor management is active, black grouse numbers have been stable or even expanding in some places.
Finland teaches exactly the same lesson, actually. Black grouse thrive there in many areas, and it's largely attributed to the fact that hunters actively control predator numbers, particularly foxes and crows. The bald truth seems to be that this particular species, perhaps because of its specific needs and vulnerability, simply cannot thrive alongside dense human populations unless human beings actively intervene. We need to reduce the populations of those subsidized predators and manage the habitat carefully. And realistically, that kind of intervention, particularly the predator control, cannot easily be done at the necessary scale, except by people with an interest in game management, like hunters or gamekeepers.
Which leads to a rather stark conclusion. Britain's current reluctance, maybe, or inability to pursue these kinds of management policies more widely, means we might be responsible for possibly, probably, committing our own bird of paradise to national extinction in the coming decades.
Yeah.
It's a really haunting image, isn't it? Thinking of those leak sites, those dawn displays, the lager can sneezes, and those bubbling ruku calls just falling silent on the wind. Hashtag, outro. Wow, we've really journeyed quite a way, haven't we? From the bizarre beauty of that black grouse leak, watching them hunched in the midwinter cold, all the way to the astonishing, maybe unsettling reach of sexual selection in shaping our own human minds, our ancient tools, even our most cherished traits like art, humor, maybe even kindness. And then we circled right back to the black grouse itself, now facing a very different kind of human-driven pressure, one where our active intervention, paradoxically, seems to be its only real hope.
It really does reiterate that profound insight, doesn't it? That the human mind itself might just be one of sexual selection's greatest, most extravagant creations. And that mate choice, this process of choosing partners based on attractive traits, is a most far-reaching idea. Often more powerful even than just raw survival. It is a radical theory, no doubt about it. And in some ways, maybe it feels a bit demeaning to think our highest faculties might be just for showing off. But then again, science is rather specialized for centuries in taking human beings' view of themselves down a peg or two, hasn't it? We're perhaps not always the rational survival machines we like to think we are.
So let's leave you with this final thought. If evolution's most powerful driving force isn't just survival of the fittest, but also, perhaps equally or even more powerfully, reproduction of the sexiest, then how much of your own daily life, your ambitions, your aspirations, the things you create, maybe even your acts of kindness, how much of that might truly be, deep down, a silent, perhaps unconscious performance? One designed ultimately to attract and choose a mate. What useful things do you find yourself doing that might